100 silver ghosts for the Silver Jubilee. Based on that simple idea, the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club and Kindred Souls are assembling here in the Home Park at Windsor the greatest cavalcade of one-make of motor cars ever seen. Over 450 pre-war Rolls-Royce and Bentley cars will this morning drive from the water meadows here by the River Thames, up the hill past the Round Tower, through the castle and on through Windsor Great Park to the Silver Ring at Ascot to join hundreds of their post-war colleagues. And Her Majesty the Queen will be graciously pleased to accept this Jubilee tribute in person in the inner quadrangle of Windsor Castle as the cavalcade rolls, or should I say whispers past. Eric Barris is the secretary of the organizing club. Congratulations, Eric. A major feat of logistics, apart from anything else.
Yes, indeed. We have a total of more than 850 cars all over Europe, all over the United Kingdom, from America, from Australia even, and we're extremely proud of them. A point I'd like to make right at the outset, of course, is that the club is really about people as well as about motor cars.
Certainly. Well, let's start with the motor cars, and this one in particular, because this is the original Silver Ghost. Indeed, it is the only car truly entitled to be called Silver Ghost, although all the subsequent 40-50 models between 1907 and 1925 have come to be known as Silver Ghosts. But it was this car which, in stripped down and polished chassis form, was the sensation of the motor show at Olympia in 1906. The 2,000-mile trial followed, the heroic 15,000-mile trial very shortly thereafter, and really it was this car and the other Ghosts which established the tradition, the legend of excellence all over the world, wasn't it?
Oh, indeed. It hit the world by storm. It was a car of such refinement, of such regularity, that everybody wanted it. And of course the reputation was established, and that delightful sobriquet, the best car in the world, was actually applied to it by a contemporary motoring correspondent. And of course it stuck to the car very properly ever since.
Let's get to know her a little better. Acetylene headlamps, of course.
Yes, indeed. Silver plated, as is all the bright work on this particular car, and with enormous great gasworks on the side to provide the necessary juice.
Let's have a look at the heart of the motor car. And there it is, all 7 litres of it.
Yes, very simple engine. The blocks cast 2 lots of 3. It's a side valve engine. Remarkably economical, considering its age and size. You can get 18 to the gallon under favourable circumstances, and it has been known to get up to almost 80 miles an hour.
A very exciting ride.
Indeed.
From the Ghost to the Phantom, this one of 1926, the proud property of Mr. Bill Meredith Earns, a well-known Midlands businessman, collector, and museum proprietor himself. Tell us your story about this car, Bill.
Well, yes, I've been anxious to find a really original, unmucked about with example of a Phantom 1. And I thought to myself, where might they still be? And I thought, India. So I went to India, and after some long negotiations and difficulties, tracked down a lady in Hyderabad who was the widow of the Prime Minister, Nawab ad-Dawla, who formerly owned this magnificent car. Hadn't been used for 20 years. It is sitting outside. The palace is all sort of weed-grown and falling down. The car's in an open garage outside, very neglected. Obviously, tires all perished and flat, and so forth.
And you restored it to this magnificent...
Indeed, indeed, indeed.
It has royal connotations.
Yes, indeed. When the Prime Minister was alive, all our dignitaries used to visit, including the Duke of Windsor.
Who actually
rode in this car, yes, indeed.
Have a good day,
She's
Bill.
very proud. Thank you very much. Good.
Mr. Frank Cook is one of our visitors from the United States. Welcome, sir. Tell us about your motor car.
It's a 1914 Silver Ghost, whose chassis was shipped to Inskip in New York, and the Brewster Salamanca body put on it, which is still on the car today. We acquired the car about 15 years ago, and it's given us an immense amount of pleasure. It has been driven probably 25,000 miles by us. It was sent from the States to go on the Alpine tour. And
that was, what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
That was 1973.
Yes.
And it has, rather than to take it back, we left it with our good friend Captain Peter Baines, so that when we had the good fortune of coming to Britain, we could enjoy using it again.
You really get your money's worth out of this car.
Oh, indeed
Mr.
we did, and it gives us great pleasure to have it left over here with Captain Baines.
Well, you are very welcome, sir, and no doubt you're looking forward to the drive up into the castle.
Yes, we are. We indeed are. And then after that, we've always admired Robbie Burns and good Scotch whiskey, so we intend to go up and sample both.
Have a lovely trip.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Millard Newman is another visitor from the United States, and he's got a very special Silver Ghost. Whisper, whisper. Tell us about this car, Mr. Newman.
This car is the first Rolls-Royce ever shipped to America. It, after the company's 551, this is chassis 553.
How long have you had it yourself?
I've had it since about 1960.
And did you have to do a lot of restoration work on it?
Complete restoration when I did it, but it was several years ago.
I admire very much your soft top, which must be the biggest on any Silver Ghost.
Yes, it's quite a large top. It's almost like a circus tent.
Any tendency to take off in high winds?
No, it manages to stay down pretty well.
Well, let's hope it stays down and that the weather stays fine for you. Thank you, Mr. Newman.
Thank you.
So the Silver Ghosts established the legend of Rolls-Royce worldwide. They raced, rallied, broke records, carried royalty, and served as armored cars. And today, they and their sisters salute the Queen in Windsor Castle. And here in the quadrangle of the castle, the scene is set, and what a setting in the very heart of the Queen's home at Windsor. The scene is set and the players are assembled for this pageant of British engineering history spanning the years from 1903 to 1939, and stretching before them one of the most splendid vistas in Britain. The long walk, 3 miles dead straight through the great park, past the famous Copper Horse to the silver ring at Ascot, empty now, but soon to be filled with these vehicles now at Windsor and the post-war ones, and tomorrow everything from steam engines to racing cars as well, all assembled for the delight of all ages and to raise money for the Silver Jubilee Fund. They're the first 3 cars which Her Majesty will see when she comes out from the Sovereign's entrance there. And there, the car, the 2-cylinder, 10-horsepower Rolls-Royce 2-seater, which started it all. One of only 3 remaining, all here. It was the performance of this prototype built by the engineer Royce which attracted the driver, businessman, and enthusiast Rolls and led directly to the formation of their partnership in 1904. And now, without fanfare or ceremony, the Queen enters the quadrangle. This is a private occasion, accompanied by Mr. Kit Aston, former mayor and chairman of the Windsor and Maidenhead Royal Jubilee Committee. Mr. John Schroeder, the chairman of the club, is presented to Her Majesty, and Mrs. Schroeder. Tremendous day for all these private owners, of course. Mr. Schroeder is the chairman, and now are presented other officers of the club. Mr. Roy Brooks, the vice chairman, Lieutenant Colonel Eric Barris, now the secretary, who will be joining me in a few minutes in the commentary box, Mrs. Barris, and then Mr. Peter Baines, the assistant secretary, Mr. Brian Munro, Mr. Paul Sutherland, the vice chairman of the Jubilee Tribute Committee, and Mr. Lawrence Dalton, who had the onerous task of editing the very handsome souvenir program. These, then, are the men responsible for this great occasion. And despite our anxiety about the weather, the Queen has brought her sunshine with her, and the quadrangle of her Windsor home could not look more lovely. And after meeting the officers, the Queen will meet the cars. And the first car she is being escorted to now by Mr. John Schroeder is the 1924 4050 Cabriolet by Barker, Rolls-Royce have certainly attracted more specialist coach work than any car in history, simply because until 1945 they only built chassis and engines, no bodies, and that's why we will be talking about a lot about bodywork. Mr. Edward Harris, the president of the club, bought that car for 37.10 old money from a tinker not very many years ago, and what a buy that was. Now, the 1901 two-cylinder, 10-horsepower de Coville. Henry Royce, then an ex-railway apprentice turned electrical engineer, bought one of those cars second-hand in 1903. Now, in those days, French cars called the tune, and Royce, dissatisfied with the rough running common to all cars of the period, decided to improve on it. He built his own car with 2 apprentices based on that design, and the first outing was 15 miles, totally uneventful. Now a very handsome car, the 1905 Light 20, 4-cylinder, 4-litre, similar to the car which C.S. Rhodes drove to victory in the 1906 TT in the Isle of Man, thereby blazing the brilliant competition trail in which early Rolls-Royce cars took on and beat all comers from New York to Monte Carlo. Only one other car of that type exists today. This one belongs to that great figure in the world of historic cars, Mr. Stanley Sears. It's driven on the Brighton Run annually by young Mr. Jack Sears, who tells me that he has considerable difficulty in keeping it down to 70 miles an hour. 4-litre, 4-cylinder, and in other words, each one of those cylinders is the size of a mini engine. Queen obviously very pleased with the occasion so far. A Rolls-Royce enthusiast herself, one may say, and her family before her for a great many years. A private occasion, as I said, no canoped days, no fanfare of trumpets, no Royal Guard of Honor, except the officers of the Rolls-Royce Enthusiasts Club. Tremendous story of effort and achievement to bring all these cars here to Windsor today. As Eric Barras said, they've been driven from all over the country, indeed all over the world. Never before have 100 Silver Ghosts been assembled in one place. There are a great many more than 100 Ghosts, as well as the others, through which we shall try to tell you the story of Rolls-Royce development. So the procession whispers into action. Round the quadrangle, past the Sovereign's entrance in the corner there, and out through the George IV gateway. They will turn right, quite a tight turn for some of these big cars. A charming informality about the whole thing. So through the George IV gateway and out onto the Long Walk. They're looking from the Copper Horse. There they go. 3 miles dead straight ahead of them, and no doubt some of the more enthusiastic enthusiasts will be winding up some of the faster cars down there, although I'm bound to say, so far they're setting off at a very stately pace indeed. The public highway crosses the Long Walk at that point. I'm told it will be closed. They've left it rather late. Well, they've got a long drive ahead of them down to Ascot, and the logistics of the exercise is so complex that I think some time will have to be made up later on in this drive. But that, as I say, will no doubt delight many of the more sporting drivers, including my old friend John Bolster, who's at the wheel of his short chassis Silver Ghost there. But now the Ghosts were succeeded by the Phantom One. This is a 1925 Phantom One, the 4050 New Phantom, as it was called. on an updated Ghost chassis with a brand new 6-cylinder pushrod engine of 7.6 litres, maximum speed 75 miles an hour, in production from 1925 to 29. Over 2,000 cars built at Derby and over 1,000 built at Springfield, Massachusetts. It's not generally realized, I think, that the early Rolls were built in the United States. That one has a Salamanca cabriolet body by Binde of Paris and comes from Switzerland. The owner is Dr. Domeniconi, the chairman of the Swiss section of the club. The long cavalcade. Yes, there's going to be a certain amount of anxiety about clutches there, I should think, at this very slow speed. I'll just check that point with Eric Barras.
Yes, it is a point, although they're very solid, very robust. They do tend to slip a bit, but I don't think it's going to affect them.
Full of confidence. Eric Barras glowing with pleasure and satisfaction from his presentation to the Queen. And all these lovely people who've come from so far, enjoying this magic moment when they show off their beloved motor cars to the Sovereign in this delightfully informal, private atmosphere. Mr. John Schroeder, the chairman, keeping the Queen briefed as this incredible assortment of cars goes by. The disabled people in the corner there are members of the Windsor and Maidenhead Sports Group for the Disabled, and Ben, the Motor Industry Benevolent Fund. Sunlight and shadow picking up this incredible assortment of bodywork which I drew to your attention a few moments ago. No two of these cars identical. There's a gentleman's town carriage if ever there was one. And you notice the diversity of approaches to take advantage of a nice sunny morning like this, with the cabriolets and the tourers and the close-coupled coupes. We took the Rolls and drove to Menton. Those were the days. Well, the Phantom 1 was followed in 1929 by the Phantom 2. Again, a highly successful car. 1,770 built at Derby with minor changes in 1931 and 33. That car had a completely new chassis with an uprated engine to 7.6 litres. By the way, if you hear us talking about 2025s and 4050s and so on, those figures relate to the old pre-war RAC ratings, of course. The 4050 was actually rated at 43.3 horsepower. The Phantom 2 went on to have a higher compression ratio because Rolls-Royce engineering is a story of consistent development. Here we see the cavalcade approaching the quadrangle. As I said, coming up the hill past the Rhine Tower, through the old town. Blue banners lining the route, which will certainly stay up throughout the Jubilee period, because Windsor and Maidenhead are really making a great effort for the Jubilee. And this, in fact, is the Phantom 2 from the middle period. 31, a Sedanka de Ville by Barker, a very original car, this. That is to say, very few replacement parts have been added over the 46 years of its life. The property of Mr. Tom Mason.
Yes, Tom's great collector of cars. The point I'd like to make very quickly is that practically all these cars have been restored and are maintained by their owners. They don't just own them, they love them, they work on them, and this is how they present them.
And they are by no means all millionaires.
No, indeed. The wonderful thing about the club is that we have a whole social spectrum covered. We have a postman who runs the most beautiful 2025, and he frequently chats with belted earls with great success because he's so knowledgeable.
The world's greatest living authority on the subject, to coin a phrase. Over 450 vehicles to drive through the quadrangle in this very short space of time. Now, the head of the procession now faced with the somewhat hazardous task of crossing the public highway and getting through that vast crowd there on their way to the Copper Horse. And meantime, of course, the procession continuing to pass the sovereign, we have what could only be described as a classic concertina. Well, I mentioned earlier that the Silver Ghost served as armored cars. Here's one in the procession, driven by Sound Best. Only the best is scarcely good enough. This is a real Lawrence of Arabia car. Silver Ghost armored cars served in the desert areas right up until the mid-20s. Served, of course, in the First World War too. Indeed, Henry Royce's contribution to the well-being of the country was not confined purely to his engineering genius.
Oh, no, indeed. His cars, of course, as we just said, the chassis formed the basis of armoured cars, of ambulances, of staff cars. And on the subject of those armoured cars, some of them were still in use in 1940. The 11th Hussars used them, and some were actually fitted with turrets made by Fraser-Nash, which is quite remarkable.
And slightly ironic. And of course the other great contribution of Henry Royce to defence was in the world of aero engines. There are those who say that the Rolls-Royce aero engines were the turning point in the air war of the 14-18 war, let alone the 39-45 war. What a marvelous opportunity for the crowds in the long walk to enjoy the cars at close quarters, rather closer than the organizers anticipated, in that they have come to a halt, but not to worry. Gives the Queen longer than she could have anticipated to look at individual motor cars as they go past, and there is certainly plenty to delight the eyes of anyone, whether they have a great love for motor cars or not, because there is an aesthetic appeal about this historic coachwork which I think is totally undeniable. And as I said earlier, every car an individual, even though they are classified by their type names. I've mentioned the Silver Ghosts, the 4050s, and the long line of Phantoms 1, 2, and 3. The Phantom 3 came on in 1936 and was only in production for 3 years. Only 710 of those cars were built, in contrast to the Silver Ghost, including the armored cars, of which no less than 7,870 were built between 1907 and 1925, including 1,700 built at Springfield, Massachusetts. The tourist season already well underway here in Windsor, and many thousands of additional people have come in to see the procession this morning. most of these cars going past variations of the 4050, the Silver Ghost chassis, still with that 7-litre 6-cylinder engine, which we gave you a glimpse of earlier. Car number 193, a 1925 4050, a special Phaeton by Brewster of New York with a... That's a superb body, Eric.
Yes, well, that is, in fact, a Hooper Tourer, absolute classic. This is the sort of Dawnford Yates type of Ghost, absolutely traditional.
Now, this is the left-hand drive car that I was mentioning, the special Phaeton by Brewster of New York. Spent 47 years in California, that car, and the sun hasn't bleached the paint, you'll notice. And here is the last of the Ghosts, 1913 1450 Tourer in the Roi des Belges style, the same as the original Silver Ghost, by Woodall Nicholson, owned by Mr. John Leppard. Now back to 1921. To the 20 horsepowers. In fact, this is the oldest 20 in the cavalcade, chassis number 4G, just emerging from the archway of the state entrance tower. This car, believe it or not, was a product of the Depression after the First World War. Sales of Silver Ghosts were slow, and Royce was persuaded by the fabulous Claude Johnson, the managing director of the company, to build a cheaper and simpler car for the owner-driver, designed mostly at Royce's country home at Wittering, where poor health by now obliged him to spend most of his time, in collaboration with Ivan Evenden, who still lives at Wittering, and I believe is waiting today at Ascot to welcome these cars. A marvellous day for the old gentleman. 6-cylinder OHV engine of a mere 3,150 cc's, centre gear change, rear brakes only, and a maximum speed of 60 miles an hour, a typical modest claim. That was a pretty exciting ride, and, as so often the case, an instant commercial success. 2,940 were built in 7 years of production. Here you see the huge crowd strategically placed on the hill past the round tower. And now the leaders of the cavalcade getting down at last towards the Copper Horse at the end of the long walk, and someone waving his following car past. Two lines of traffic down through the gardens there. Just a little further down the avenue, Jubilee trees have been planted by members of the royal family, including His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, just down there. The long walk is essentially an avenue of trees right the way down to the statue at the end. Now, as we hoped, some of the more enthusiastic enthusiasts using the excuse to make up a little time. The costumes of the occupants almost vibe with the elegance of the coachwork. There's every kind of dress, from modern to the 90s and so on and so on. Ah, there's one of the earlier ones on his way, Eric.
Yes, indeed. That's the 3-cylinder 15-horsepower car down from Scotland. It's a superb one. It's the only one of its kind in the world, although it is rumoured that there is another in India, but that we have to find out. It does seem that we've created the most expensive traffic jam in history, doesn't it?
Yeah, I congratulate you on that. That, of course, was one of the 4 original Rolls-Royce models, but the introduction of the Silver Ghost was so successful that they abandoned all, and for many, many years, the Silver Ghost was the only Rolls-Royce car built. One reason why there are so many Ghosts here today, of course. Mr. Kit Aston on the Queen's right, enjoying it very much. Great Rolls-Royce enthusiast himself. And now the Rolls-Royce 2530, which has brought us right up to 1936. This had the 2025 engine bored out to 4.2 litres with a Borgenbeck clutch and Stromberg carburetor. 1,200 were built in the 2 years of its production. That one has a lovely sports saloon body by Hooper and had one owner to 1976 with 80,000 miles on the clock, now owned by Mr. David Woolhead. This car was an important landmark because it was the first time that Rolls-Royce bought out.
Yes, this is perfectly true. You see, Henry Royce, often people have said that he wasn't an innovator, and to some extent this is true, but he liked to see other people's good ideas and improve them. And of course Rolls-Royce still do this. They get a good thing and they make it better.
You'll notice in our close-ups that some Rolls-Royce cars have red labels and some have black labels. There is a popular story that the label went back to mourn the death of Henry Royce just approaching his 70th birthday. That, in fact, is not true.
Well, there's no substance in it. I think a more likely story is that the Rolls-Royce owner of the day thought that red was rather vulgar.
Look at those lovely little carriage lamps on the side there. Now this is a particularly interesting car, 1930, and as near as you can get to an all-American Rolls, because this is a Springfield 2025 built in Massachusetts with a striking panel broom body by F.R. Wood of New York, owned by Mr. Joseph Mingolla of that city. The 2025, which replaced the 20 in 1929, had the same engine bored out to 3.7 litres with an upgraded chassis, and further mods were made in 30 and 32, bringing the maximum speed to 76 miles an hour. Just look at that. Imagine riding in that beauty at 76 miles an hour. This is a very luxurious and fashionable town car of the period. The interior trim is in bird's eye maple, and it has rear direction indicators, which must have been amongst the earliest ever fitted. And here's another landmark in the history of Rolls-Royce, 1938, what could be described as the first of the modern cars, the 2530 Wraith with independent front suspension and synchromesh on second, third and top. The standard four-door saloon costs £1,845, but this is a rather special 1939 model by Park Ward, which was allocated to the then General Sir Bernard Montgomery of the CNC 21st Army Group as his staff car. And this car landed on Juno Beach as the first staff car to arrive after D-Day on June the 9th, 1944. It's still in the service with the Royal Corps of Transport and is entered today by Lieutenant Colonel J.G. Lowe. So there's Monty's staff car. What a turn-up. Well, imagine seeing that on Juno Beach. Must have been sensational. Ah, yes. Well, now here we see the Bentleys, the Rolls-Royce Bentleys, in the procession. In 1936, when the 2025 was bored out to become the 2530, the 3.5 Bentley was stretched to become the 4.25. But the story behind it was that in the 30s, the firm of W.O. Bentley, whose cars had thundered into history at Le Mans and Brooklands and so on, was in very serious financial trouble, and it was bought up by Rolls-Royce, some say to stifle the opposition, others to preserve the good name of British engineering. But certainly W.O. Bentley was not allowed to participate in the subsequent design of cars bearing his name. So we have 3.5 and 4.25 Bentleys here today of that immediate pre-war period. This is a 3.5 Bentley of 1933, actually the 4th to be made. This was rebuilt by the owner as a short chassis, actually 12 inches shorter, and the bonnet was lowered. It was virtually a redesigned 2025, but a very elegant car and very elegant body. The owner is Mr. Carl Sargent, first of the silent sports cars attracting the attention of the Queen. Out into the country, and there's the avenue through the Great Park at the Copper Horse end of the Long Walk, and the procession now much more smoothly underway, to the immense relief of Eric Barris, the secretary, sitting alongside me, and indeed everyone else concerned with the massive logistics of this. Over 800 motor cars involved. It's a lot of motor. Here's a charming sight. This is a Rolls-Royce 2530 of 1936. This was the car, the first of the cars to have a non-Rolls-Royce carburetor. 1,200 of these were built in 2 years of production. This one has a sports loom body by Hooper. Yes. Well, there's a young lady certainly making the most of her occasion. Oh, look at that, Eric.
Yes, well, formal coach work, if you like. Again, you see, they're being bidden rather firmly to get a move on, aren't they? And they're perfectly capable of doing it. These cars in touring trim will cruise at 60 to 65 miles an hour, fully loaded, quite comfortably, and still return something in the region of 18 to the gallon on 2-star petrol.
And you see the big boots, luggage boots on the back, when they really were boots, or trunks, as the Americans call them to this day. appropriate luggage for such an elegant motor car, handmade, of course. The colour schemes are almost as exciting as the coachwork, and of course many families painted the car in their own livery, but that's taking patriotism rather far.
Yes, I'm afraid that's a little breach of good taste, but as we said earlier in the programme, this club is about people, and we don't dictate to them. If this is their personal way of paying their tribute, God help it, let them exercise it.
Here, quite right. It will be interesting to see the reaction of the Queen to this particular gesture. No comment needed. And after all, it is a Silver Jubilee tribute. What could be more appropriate? And still they come through the quadrangle and out to the George IV gateway. Well, now, we saw the hold-up earlier, but nevertheless, at Ascot, here we see the head of the cavalcade arriving, going over that very soft grass there, but doing very well, despite your anxiety.
Oh, indeed. Well, that's the Light 20. This is the sister car, the car that Charlie Rolls won the 1906 Tourist Trophy race in the Isle of Man. And we had a commemorative rally there last year, and that very car repeated the original TT course in magnificent fashion. Pouring rain, thick fog, and Jack Sears was driving it at the time, and it really did go like the proverbial bomb.
As they are all going like the proverbial bomb. We've kept a very wary eye open, but no sign of mechanical trouble to date. This is the 1936 2025. It's bored out to become the 2530. And as the cars go by through the quadrangle on the ground, here perhaps the ultimate salute to Rolls-Royce engineering, and indeed by Rolls-Royce engineering to the sovereign. The Supermarine Spitfire, powered by and virtually built around its beautiful Merlin engine, which of course also powered the Hurricane, the Lancaster and the Mosquito. We'll be seeing more of these great aeroplanes, incidentally, next Sunday in our coverage of the White Waltham Jubilee Air Show. Spitfire 1, the private property of the Honourable Pat Lindsay, flown very brilliantly by Tony Bianchi, making the most of the opportunity to go down the long walk with the roads underneath. And that single Spitfire and all those beautiful cars now on their way to Ascot represent a part of our British heritage, one which we can look back to with pride and one which we might well emulate today. For the Honourable Charles Rolls and Sir Henry Royce, there was no such thing as good enough. What better tribute to the Queen in her Jubilee year?